In 2008, a teenage boy went missing. 7 years later, his remains were found wedged in the chimney of an abandoned cabin. Police deemed it an accident, but the cabin's owner claims that to be impossible. This is the strange case of Joshua Maddux, the boy in the chimney. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Ibotta. So it's about that time of year again where we all have to start buying endless amounts of junk for people even if we kind of don't want to. Case in point, Halloween is here and now you need to get candy for all those strange kids walking onto your property. The good news is that today I'm going to introduce a way to make this less painful on your wallet with Ibotta, a great and easy way to earn cash back on your everyday purchases. All you need to do is scan your receipt from any of the businesses you see here and more, and you're good to go. No couponing needed, which means I'm definitely going to be using Ibotta for all my holiday shopping, because yes, I am a penny pincher. Click the link down below to download Ibotta now and get up to a $20 sign-on bonus. Thank you Ibotta for sponsoring this video and supporting independent content on YouTube, and with that said, on to the episode.
This is Joshua Maddux. Over a decade ago, Joshua left his family home in Woodland, Colorado to never be seen alive again. According to his father, Mike, Joshua had vanished, leaving behind no indication as to his intentions or where he was going. A day passed by, and then another, and another. Eventually, the worried family had no choice but to call the police, and Joshua Maddux had been officially deemed a missing person. Posters went up, and he was even added to the national database. Of course, there was one major issue with all of this though. Joshua was 18 at the time of his disappearance, and according to his family, he was a free spirit who talked about one day going on some kind of adventure of his own. He was an adult at the time, and as such he was allowed to leave if he felt like doing so, which is what the family ultimately surrendered themselves to believing. At least that was the case until 2015. It was then that Chuck Murphy, the owner of a local construction company, was in the process of demolishing one of his old buildings. It was an almost abandoned cabin that he and his family hadn't inhabited for over a decade. When demolishing the cabin's fireplace, they made a gruesome discovery. A body had been found to have been wedged within the chimney. The decomposition was so far along that they described what they found as skeletal or mummified. Authorities were able to identify the corpse via dental records, and surely enough, it was Joshua. Naturally, you'd expect this discovery to have brought closure to the Maddux family, especially after 7 long years of wondering if Joshua was okay, but finding him in such a state only deepened the mystery.
News about Joshua quickly spread, and he was soon dubbed the boy in the chimney, and naturally everyone wanted to understand how exactly he'd ended up there in the first place. According to reports and comments made by coroner Al Bourne, what we have here is an accident. Bourne claims that he found no evidence of trauma of any sort, and because of this he ultimately ruled out foul play, concluding that Joshua had climbed into the chimney by his own free will. This theory piggybacks off the notion that Joshua was adventurous, wanting to explore what appeared to be an abandoned cabin in the woods. Bourne suggested that while doing so, Joshua simply got stuck and eventually died from either dehydration or hypothermia. The exact cause couldn't be determined given the state of Joshua's body. But, of course, if it were that simple, then we wouldn't be sitting here today talking about this. In most cases I see discussed online, the speculation and theorizing usually finds its origins in the comments or forums, but this time we see the opposing arguments coming from someone who was right there when the body was found. Chuck Murphy, again the owner of the property where Joshua's body was found, insists that this was no accident. According to Chuck, Joshua couldn't have climbed up to the top due to what he described as a rebar cage covering the chimney's opening. A 2015 article from the Pikes Peak Courier tells us that Murphy was convinced that Joshua had been murdered, possibly forced into the chimney from the bottom opening while alive. Murphy also entertained the possibility that Joshua had been murdered in the cabin and his body placed in the chimney in order to hide it. Murphy also points out a few interesting things that only add to the convoluted nature of this case. First off, Joshua was found mostly naked, stripped of everything aside from his thermal top. The rest of his clothing was said to be found inside the cabin by the base of the fireplace, implying that Joshua already had access to the property by other means and had no reason to break in from the top. This back and forth between medical examiner and property owner led to a lot of speculation on sites like Reddit, and at one point one user on an unrelated thread told a story that gripped the attention of many users following this case. The question posted on Ask Reddit called upon those who personally know or knew killers, the OP wondering how the news had come to affect their lives. One user posted about an old acquaintance from high school named Andy, providing this article for greater context. He explains that his good friend Josh had gone missing after befriending Andy, and that he suspected something horrible had happened. Andy and Josh were supposedly planning a trip together to New Mexico, but that ended up not happening since, as we all know, Josh went missing. At some point after that, Andy made his way over to New Mexico on his own, where he stabbed an innocent person to death for seemingly no reason. Once news of this had made it back home, the user, along with some other people, had gone to the authorities to suggest that Andy may be a suspect and a key to finding out what happened to Josh. Police, of course, disregarded this since, as stated earlier, Josh was already a legal adult at the time of his disappearance. There was no body found just yet, so the claims about Andy were brushed off. This even though witnesses claimed to have heard Andy mention how he, quote, put Josh in a hole and other things to that effect. The user and the linked article both mention Andy admitting to killing another New Mexico citizen, this time a woman who he claimed to have stuffed in a barrel. And while there apparently was a woman found dead in a barrel in the area Andy mentioned, someone else had gotten the blame for it, at least according to the post, which I'll maintain is just the accounts of an anonymous Reddit user. Despite this, it does make you wonder, and while it would be nice to assume that this is exactly what happened to Josh, there are other things to take into consideration that keep this case completely disjointed. As mentioned a second ago, one thing that really threw people for a loop about this case was the fact that Joshua had been almost completely nude. Again, his clothing supposedly located just outside the fireplace but inside the cabin. It raises obvious questions, like why Joshua felt the need to derobe, or how the clothes ended up inside the cabin if Joshua hadn't even made it inside. If you follow a lot of mysteries and cases similar to this one, you're probably thinking that a possible explanation for Joshua's nudity would be paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon caused by late-stage hypothermia, in which one begins to feel extremely hot, causing them to undress in an attempt to cool down. Since Joshua's body was found only wearing a thermal top, we can assume that he died sometime in the colder months, so this could very well be why he was naked. If you'll recall, Alborn also mentioned hypothermia as a likely cause of death. Still, this doesn't explain how Joshua ended up in the chimney. Perhaps he was outside freezing and desperately tried to enter the cabin for warmth before finding himself wedged. But if that's true, then how did his clothing end up inside the cabin? Did they actually end up in there at all? Chuck Murphy mentioned how a large breakfast nook had been placed in front of the fireplace, blocking it off. But if the nook had been occupying the space in front of the fireplace, then how could Joshua's clothing have ended up supposedly found there? Unfortunately, it's unclear when the breakfast nook was moved. Although Murphy and his family hadn't inhabited the cabin in over a decade, they claim to have still dropped by every now and then, so it's completely possible that the nook had been moved sometime after Joshua's passing. Murphy also noted a foul smell coming from the cabin which he couldn't explain, and that the cabin had been overrun with rodents. Setting aside the breakfast nook dilemma for a second, let's say that Joshua did in fact drop his clothes down the chimney before climbing in for some reason. Once he got stuck, I suppose it wouldn't be completely out of the realm of possibility that some kind of animal moved his clothing. Unfortunately, not much details were given about the condition of his clothing and whether or not they contained any clues. Now, all of this, of course, would only be possible if Joshua was able to enter the top of the chimney, which, according to Murphy, was impossible due to the rebar cage covering its top entrance. The problem with this statement, however, is that law enforcement was never able to recover the cage. According to them, it wasn't found on the scene, Murphy assuming that it had already been collected and thrown out. On top of this, some users have pointed out Murphy's inconsistencies with how he describes the caging. In some articles, he calls it rebar, and in others, he calls it wiring, something much more common in chimneys but also much easier to remove if someone wanted to. Despite Murphy insisting that this caging made top entry impossible, he didn't seem to be sure if it was even still there by the time of demolition. There's also some debate about the bottom entrance of the fireplace, Murphy himself noting the presence of an insert that others note would make it pretty much impossible for Joshua to climb up or even be forced up the chimney depending on the model. Needless to say, there are a lot of issues with the information Murphy provided, some pointing out that the man is currently in his 80s and perhaps just doesn't have the best memory. One user chimes in on this, insisting that although he's an old man, he's, quote, incredibly sharp and not a spacey 80. But who knows? Clearly, Chuck Murphy's intentions were to help out as much as he could in any way that he could, and if he was convinced that the chimney's caging had remained intact, then he was right to bring it up to the authorities so they could do as thorough of an investigation as possible. But what about the Andy theory? Although it sounds like the most juicy and movie-like, there unfortunately just isn't any court-grade proof to pin this one. If, let's say, Andy and Joshua went out exploring one night and Joshua ended up dead, it would be extremely difficult for one man to stuff a body up a chimney, especially one which again contained a metal insert that supposedly would have made the entrance too small for a body anyway. But what if Andy shoved Joshua down the chimney instead? The same issue applies. Joshua was listed as being about 150 pounds at the time of his disappearance, and lugging 150 pounds of literally dead weight into a roof in some ways might be even more challenging than going in from the bottom. Keep in mind the autopsy didn't show any signs of traumatic injury, and since Andy is the real ultra-violent type, I have trouble believing he'd killed Joshua without causing any damage at all. Some claim Andy had help, that more than one killer was involved, but again, it's just so unlikely given all the factors at play. The list of questions surrounding this case just keeps going on. Like, if the door to the cabin had been found unlocked, or had there been any signs of Joshua being able to get inside aside from his clothing. Overall, the defining characteristic of this case is a lot of hearsay and a lack of official documents that would enable us to tell the misinformation from solid fact. As for how things stand now, Joshua's death has legally been deemed an accident, but as for why or how it happened exactly, at this point it seems we're likely to never know. Thank you all so much for watching, and I really hope that you're enjoying this year's spooky season. In case you're signed up for my Patreon but just haven't checked it out in a while, I've been posting recommendations for content that you should watch this Halloween season, and while on that note, I'd like to give a huge thank you and shout out to the following patrons. Okay, here we go. Matt, Mark, Stefan, I hope I pronounced it right, Justin, Julian, oh my god, Avocadros, I hope I pronounced that right too, Shelby, Spooky Q, VHS Squid, Garth, Jay, I'm gonna call you Shadow again, still sorry, that's officially your nickname for me, Danielle, and Ursula. You guys are hands down the best, and with that all said, I'll see you all again soon.